Welcome to the ESI podcast series. We are so grateful that you could join us today, and we hope that you will enjoy this episode. Make sure to follow us on our Spotify account, and don't forget to turn on your notification bells so that you are aware of when we post new episodes. Enjoy. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you're joining us today. Thank you so much and welcome back to ESI Press Podcast. This episode, we are covering a second part of our human rights segment where we are discussing all things related to human rights and perceptions related towards that. If you haven't listened to the first part of this segment, please go ahead and listen to it with Dr. Corley. What an incredible conversation. And we continue with that today with Michael, who's joining us all the way from the United States. Michael, how are you doing? Just give our listeners a shout out. Just let us know how you're doing today.
Hi, Yanga. Really good to speak with you today. I'm doing well, thanks. Here, coming to you from Washington, D.C., where I've been based for about 3 years or so now, originally from South Africa, but I've been in the U.S. for a couple of years studying and working, and really excited to be speaking with you today. And shout out to all your listeners.
Brilliant. Awesome. So Michael completed his MA Law at the University of Pretoria while concurrently finishing his honors in political sciences. He then went on to complete his master's in political sciences at Georgetown University on a Fulbright scholarship. Over the last year, he has been completing an internship at the Albright Stonebridge Group in Washington, D.C., and his focus is on African development and governance, but he has a unique perspective on human rights, having studied both law and politics. And as a result of that, we really do appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today. But as I mentioned a bit earlier on, that we are going to be talking about human rights and essentially how they're perceived in different parts of the world. The bigger focus in the previous segment was human rights from an internal perspective, South African giving the perspective of that, and someone who looks at it from a criminology perspective and also from a social worker perspective. So I think it's going to be pretty interesting where our conversation goes now, where we look at it at both a law and a political perspective. But before we get into the crux of that stuff, when we talk about human rights, we generally refer to the basic human rights outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Michael, do you think human rights are viewed in different ways in different countries?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. I think the reality is that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created as this kind of overarching concept of human rights that would hopefully be adopted across the world. But the reality is that each country may have different views, both in a positive sense and a negative sense. In kind of the stronger democracies, they may even expand upon the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and have rights and responsibilities that go beyond that. Whereas other countries, especially maybe more authoritarian countries or countries with fewer freedoms, might not have those same human rights in the Declaration of Human Rights. And on top of that, I think there's the added complication that many of the rights that we see as human rights across the world may be broadly defined or misdefined or understood in different ways. And I think different countries definitely deal with that in different ways. So I think that does add a layer of complexity to how international human rights are approached in different contexts.
I think you've touched on it over there, that kind of dependent on the type of political system people are exposed to, the level of rights they get is affected by those particular decisions. And as a result, we know that millions of people's rights have not been met. And even within contexts in which they have political systems that do support human rights, some of their rights are not met to begin with. Maybe we'll get into that a bit later on in our conversation. I just want to ask, maybe from a practical perspective, are there any legal measures that protect people whose rights have not been met from an international standpoint? And can governments be forced to protect everyone's rights? Here, maybe the thinking has to do, with sovereignty and the difficult balance of states being able to do what they want to do, and no other state can tell another state what to do. But it almost seems as though when it comes to matters of human rights, lines can get blurred when it comes to that. So yeah, do you have any thoughts regarding that?
Yeah, I think you definitely raise an important issue there in terms of lines being blurred. And I think when it comes to international human rights, particularly at a global level, you think of the UN, you think of how the UN operates, and the fact that in essence, it all comes down to a delicate balance of diplomacy and tacit acceptance from certain countries. There are universal declarations, there are treaties against torture, there are treaties against slavery, there are all other forms of treaties against different practices that may infringe upon people's human rights, but they are only powerful insofar as a country accepts them and puts them into their local law. And then you do have obviously mechanisms like the International Court of Justice, International Human Rights Court, but the challenge there also comes into how in practice, as you mentioned in the beginning of your statement, it actually comes into effect. And I think we've seen many instances where maybe certain countries' leaders or certain countries themselves have been put under more scrutiny when it comes to human rights abuses than others. And then it also comes down to legal mechanisms within countries themselves. A certain country may very well adopt those really strong rights into their own constitutions, have a robust legal system within which individuals can use that justice system to gain justice and protect their rights. But on the other hand, as I mentioned before, in a system where there aren't these safety mechanisms, there aren't these checks and balances, it is very hard for one to assert their rights and have justice be brought upon those who infringe rights, and especially on an international scale. A quick example to raise is kind of what we're seeing happening over the last few months in the Ukraine-Russia crisis that's going on, or the ongoing apartheid we see in Palestine, where you have the exact same thing that's happening with Israelis or that's happening to Palestinians is not being seen in the same lens as what's happening to Ukrainians. In Ukraine, it says there's human rights abuse. In Israel, it's a fight for sovereignty. In Palestine, it's internal conflict. And I think that's a big challenge that we have in different, there's a myriad of examples that I could raise, but I think that's just a good juxtaposition to show how human rights, even on a global scale and in terms of how they're applied in different contexts and in an almost uneven way.
Definitely. I think then when we talk about the practicalities of human rights, often we speak about the necessity of advocating for human rights, the fact that we attach dignity when it comes to human rights, we attach individual freedoms when it comes to human rights. But very often in the conversation, we rarely ever bring up human responsibilities. From an international perspective, how does that look like? How can I here in South Africa speak on human responsibilities to, let's say, the example that you already made of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict? How do I speak towards human responsibilities regarding that? Or are those responsibilities somewhat shifted over to the state?
I think it's challenging given that the word responsibility, or even used in this context, could once again mean a number of things. But say I guess I'll talk about it in two ways. The one being this kind of individual responsibility, which I know you mentioned came up in the previous podcast. I think it's interesting looking at the idea of a right to and a right from, where you have an active way of someone saying, like, you need the right to, say, running water. That's something that you then need a system in place where you have a government that's providing infrastructure, that's providing access to clean and safe water for people to use for whatever needs they may have. And that's very much an active duty that is needed. When you think of something like a right to life, that both has the idea of we need to promote the safety of individuals, but also there's an individual responsibility that I also need to not take a life. An individual should not deprive someone of their right. I think that's a way where an individual responsibility comes, a right to privacy, a right to freedom of expression. There's ways that both government and individuals can infringe upon those rights or put the situation in place which enables those rights to be enjoyed by individuals. And I think it does become a challenge when those two are at odds, where you have individuals maybe within a country, within a system, infringing upon rights that go against laws that uphold those rights, and how the system then tries to correct that,
right,
and address those infringements. And that can also be a complicated challenge in different countries and contexts.
I think the next question I want to ask you actually is a one that is emerging quite consistently right now from an academic perspective, and perhaps also on a practical scale. Kind of this relationship between human rights being protected, being promoted, and them being in alignment with democracy, and democracy being the political system that protects them to their fullest extent. And I think the question I have for you here is the responsibility to engage in democracy universal? So in other words, when we deem change necessary, when we deem the importance of human rights, are we obligated to use various democratic tools to make that change happen, or for that activism to take fruit? Just your opinion regarding that. And I know it's a very existential question that we're all trying to navigate through, but just your view regarding that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's one of the big ones within broader academia around study of democracy, democratization, and then human rights. And I think the challenge comes into what is the best system. And obviously we have an ongoing talk about the existential international battle between a more democracy, open, rights-focused systems versus more authoritarian, dictatorship type views of governance. And I think it's an interesting one, because some critics of democracy may argue, or look at country X where, sure, they don't have freedom of expression, but everyone has running water. There is very little poverty. There are these systems that exist to provide basic needs, even if maybe the needs of freedom of religion or freedom of expression don't exist. And on the other hand, proponents of democracy will say, yes, but what point is a right if you don't have all the rights, if you don't have the possibility of all the rights? And I think, coming back to what you said near the end there in terms of this obligation, I'm a proponent, at least personally, that we do need to use a multitude of tools, especially democratic tools. I think any functioning democracy should be constantly trying to improve, constantly trying to work. And the reality of the matter is, as we said before, sometimes government fails. Or many times, unfortunately, governments fail. Many times international systems and measures don't do what they're supposed to do, or what they're supposed to do has been to create and maintain the status quo, which isn't a just, rights-focused status quo. And as a result, I think it's important to use a multitude of tools, from voting, from making one's voices heard,
right,
if needs be, protesting, activism, addressing the systemic challenges and trying to change them. And I think it obviously is a challenge, once again, context by context. In some countries, in some systems, it's very safe and possible to protest without major backlash. In others, it's not. But nonetheless, I think that something that does give me hope is, across the world, we see very innovative human rights-based activists and people who find ways to fight against the systems, even though there are many of those that are trying to maintain the status quo, or even move things to a worse situation.
Right. Let's bring this a bit closer to home for a second. As South Africans, we are privileged enough to have a constitution that enshrines human rights above all else. But there are still people living in poverty, people who don't have access to basic services, from running water to shelter or food. And usually in moments like this, the blame game needs to come on, right? The accountability game as well has to come on. And so the bigger question there is, who becomes responsible for ensuring that human rights are met, and all the promises that human rights promise that they would actually do if people are given what they're supposed to have?
Yeah, I mean, as we all know very well, South Africa has a very complex and violent past, to put it blankly. Um, we have over 400 years of oppression, colonialism, and systems that were put in place actively to deprive peoples not only of their human rights, but literally of their humanity in South Africa. And I think that the South African Constitution was a major step in the right direction. But as I said before about democracies, I'm a big proponent of living, changing constitutions. I know we want to talk a bit more about the US and South Africa, which I'll save for a moment. But the idea of the South African Constitution, for the most part, and the Constitutional Court in our system is doing a pretty good job in my eyes in terms of the living constitution aspect of saying, what do we need to change? What do we need to improve? What do we need to adapt in order to address these human rights? But the challenge comes into the reality that we're 28 years into democracy, trying to overcome 400 years of oppression and systemic deprivation of human rights within a country that is under-resourced, has many complex social issues, and unfortunately a government that for many years both has and is still corrupt and unable to meet some of those needs. And I think that's where it comes back to the responsibility of every single South African, as every single African and global citizen should stand up for the rights of themselves and for those of others. And that's where one can do this in a number of ways. We have elections coming up next year. We have constant forums where ones can raise your opinions, your voices. There's social media, which can be used for good and unfortunately also for bad. There are ways to process. There's ways to even affect those people within your families, within your communities. And I think it's each and every South African's duty and each and every person's duty to promote human rights in every space that they can, not just them for themselves, but for others as well.
Michael, I think you offer us a very unique perspective, given the position that you are in, that you've been exposed to the United States, which arguably has some of the longest reign in terms of human rights promotion and is the leading nation that supposedly, advocates for human rights to be a universal matter. I want you to tell us now, how would you describe the human rights situation over there in the United States, and give us a comparison and contrast with how that looks like over here in South Africa?
Yeah, I've definitely had a very interesting time in the US. I also happened to be here through pandemics and elections and all of that, and got for the better or worse, a front row seat to a lot of that. And I think something that always stuck with me that someone said to me, I can't quite remember who, but it just stuck with me, was that when it comes to the United States, you find the best of the best, but you also find the worst of the worst. And unfortunately, the reality is in the US, many Americans will speak about the fact that the country is a democratic experiment. They're still trying to figure it out. That they're 240 plus years into democracy, which for me is interesting because for majority of those years, only land-owning white males were considered human, were considered to be democratic subjects. So that definitely adds to the complexity. South Africa, on the other hand, as we discussed, young country, we all know this, 28 years into democracy, yet it is surprising and unsurprising how many parallels can be drawn between many of the social issues that exist in both countries. From outside of America, outside of the United States, rather, I didn't realize how much poverty, homelessness, injustice exists on the streets, how bifurcated this society is, just like South Africa. South Africa is often seen as one of the most unequal societies in the world. The US might not be that overall, but there are definitely pockets of inequality like you'll see nowhere else in the world. And I think the challenge I see and the biggest difference I've witnessed over the last few years between the US and South Africa is that, for the most part, I believe that in South Africa, the majority of people, at least the majority of people who have the ability to do so, are trying to promote a human rights forward society to try and solve the problems and make things better. There might be a small group of conservative, right-wing, former apartheid anthropologists, etc., who are still trying to promote very archaic views and very problematic ways of life. But for the most part, the general consensus is that we need more rights, we need more freedoms, we need a better society for all. Whereas what I've witnessed, unfortunately, in the US over, at least personally, over the last 3 years, over the last while, is that not only is there a group that is very happy to promote the status quo, there is also a very large group that is looking to revert things back to how they were 10, 20, 100 years ago. Not, I mean, just to name a few, we see we're in June here in the US. The Supreme Court is very shortly going to rule on whether Roe v. Wade is going to stay and whether women are going to have the rights to their own body, which for me is baffling that in 2022 that is not an enshrined right across the world. We have issues constantly across the US around Black Lives Matter, about indigenous rights, about religious freedoms of minorities that are infringed upon every single day, not to mention the fact that we're sitting in the middle of Pride Month. And we still to this day have laws that are being put in place in places like Florida and other states that are excluding literally the existence and speaking about people from the LGBTQ plus community. There's trans exclusionary laws being put in place. And I think for me, it's horrifying to witness that the reality of the matter is that within 5 to 10 years, the US, in terms of its laws at least, could very much look like the US of 50 or 100 years ago.
Right.
Where I have hope that in South Africa, in 5 to 10 years, we will have been able to say, we've made progress, we've moved forward, we're trying to address the issues. And I think I could, as you can hear, could go on very long about all these things.
No, please do.
That's just something to mention, that there's this dichotomy that's just horrifying. And I mean, something personally of I've lived in the US for 3 years. I'll be moving back to South Africa in 2 years. In 2 months rather. And then we'll at least be required to stay 2 years. And it's the choice of, do I want to live in America in the future? I'd like to, I think. But what country? Are there other countries? This idea of like, we're all global citizens in a sense, but there's these ideas of what problems does one want to live with in a society. And I guess I'll leave it there for now for
no, I definitely think you just gave us a brilliant topic that we can discuss perhaps in another episode, which I think is a conversation that is becoming very, very clear right now, that the extremism of the political spectrum over there in the US is getting more and more extreme. It is going back to that traditionalist view that people have. And in fact, I watched a documentary very recently that was talking about, the alt-right movement and how just that word alt-right has come to protect people who are saying genuinely bigoted, backward concepts and ideas of BIPOC people and Jewish people, but now they have suits and they have platforms to say it. And it's no longer a person just wearing their white robe and going around and saying things.
They're sitting in
Yes, they're sitting in Senate, they're sitting in positions of power. It is very interesting, but that's definitely a conversation for another day. But I'm so glad as well that you highlighted that for South Africa, albeit that we beat ourselves up on our progress, it is a very young democracy, but how much we have achieved is incredible. And in one of our other episodes, the conversation also came up that the fight against the lack of progress that we have in this country, where people are not having their human rights met, their democratic values being respected. At the core of it, it has to do with corruption, right? It's like the biggest cancer we have right now in our country. And it's very terrifying on how we can navigate through that. And sometimes you feel as though as a person, you don't have the power to be able to do anything. But it is in fact the democratic system that gives you the power to be able to do something in the first place. But I digress. Everybody go listen to our episode with Ambassador Uhold. We go into this in much more detail. Michael, then just to bring it on a much more practical level before we close off. What can we do to defend our own rights and other people's rights?
Yeah, I think this is something that I constantly ask myself and I constantly reflect upon. And it's difficult sometimes, as you said, when you're within a system or within a country, trying to see any progress and feel hope. I think to start very basic, I think the first thing that everyone needs to do is educate themselves and others. Know your rights, know other people's rights, and know what mechanisms exist, at least in a legalistic sense, on paper. Unfortunately, the reality is that that doesn't always lead into implementation of those laws, those rights, the practicalities of it. And that's where it takes you to the next level. Okay, you know your rights, you know what should be done to protect your rights and others. What happens when that's not being done? And that's where it's all about having your voice heard. It's all about looking at what organizations exist, what collectives exist. There's phenomenal civil society organizations in South Africa, collective groups that do some of the most amazing work you'll see around the world. Even just something that comes to top of mind in talking about basic human rights is what's happening in Nelson Mandela Bay municipality, where they're at day zero and they're running out of water as we speak. And Gift of the Givers is there. Here's an organization that is doing some of the most phenomenal human rights, humanitarian relief efforts in the world, that's in our own country. Donate to these organizations, volunteer for these organizations. I'm physically not able to because I'm across the world, but I've seen calls for volunteers saying we need people to help dig boreholes and find water for these people. And that's just a small example. So I'd say educate yourself and others, look for ways to make your voice heard, and find these organizations, collectives, and other ways to promote yourself, your own and others' human rights, whether it be voting, protesting, social awareness. I could go on, but those are just a few of my thoughts for the time.
Well, there you have it, folks. That is what we got from Michael Bongani Reinders. Thank you so much for joining us in today's episode. We really do appreciate it. And to all the viewers, be sure, viewers, I'm so used to YouTube, to all the listeners, be sure to rate our show and give us your feedback on how you find it. And until next time, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you would like to know more information about ESI Press, head on over to our website at esipress.up.ac.za. Emerging Scholars Initiative is a platform dedicated to encouraging young scholars generate a wider interest in their research. See you next time.